Okay, welcome back. James Cordner here. Thanks for tuning in to Voluntarist Academy. This is part 2 of Socratic Logic by Peter Kreeft. Part 1, there is a link in the show notes. More about the rest of the show notes later. Here is the book. I have a second edition copy. So this is Socratic Logic, a logic text using Socratic method, Platonic questions, and Aristotelian principles by Peter Kreeft. And we're just going to jump right into it. Picking up from where we left off, section 2, 17 ways this book is different. There are literally hundreds of logic texts in print, and thousands more out of print. Why one more? How is this one different? How is it better? Number 1, this book is simple. It's better for most students because it's not the best, i.e., the most advanced, sophisticated, state-of-the-art text. Most beginning students need a simpler, easier, basic logic text, just as most new computer owners would love to have a simple, quote-unquote, dumb, obedient computer that they can master and use quickly and easily, instead of one with so many bells and whistles, that by the time you master it, it's obsolete. But no one makes a dumb computer. The geniuses who make them are too proud to serve us dummies. Well, I'm not. This is a dumb logic book. It's for beginners. For instance, its most basic points, which are summarized in section 4 of this introduction, all of logic in 2 pages, are repeated so often that even the slowest and most confused students should not lose their way and lose hope. Number 2, it's user-friendly. It is for 2 kinds of users. It is a classroom text for teachers and also a do-it-yourself text for individuals. The fact that it is simple enough for an intelligent do-it-yourselfer does not mean it is less useful for a teacher as a classroom text, unless obscure classroom texts are more useful than clear and simple ones. Number 3, it's practical. It covers topics in proportion to probable student use. E.g., it devotes more space than usual to topics like 1, the Socratic method, 2, interpreting ordinary language and translating it into logical form, 3, constructing effective syllogisms, 4, material fallacies, 5, diagramming long arguments simply, and 6, smoking out hidden premises, because these are some of the logical skills we need and use the most outside a logic class. Logic is like praying, fishing, or learning a language. You learn by doing. Much of the work is in the will, not the mind, in resolution and persistence and dogged honesty. Actually practicing a few basic logical principles will make you a far more effective arguer, evaluator, researcher, and writer than knowing 10 times more and practicing it less. Most logic students learn too much, not too little. Instead of learning what they need to use, they learn what they neither need nor use. That is why this book contains many exercises on basics and only a very introductory treatment of non-basics. When we actually argue, obeying a few basic rules well is much more rare, more difficult, and more adequate than we usually think. Just imagine for a moment how some of the arguments you have heard or read would have been different if both sides had only obeyed this one elementary principle. Don't ignore your opponent's arguments and counter with your own. Don't just sit there waiting for your turn to attack. You must also defend by finding a logical fallacy, a false premise, or an ambiguous term in every single one of your opponent's arguments. Practical usefulness is the main reason for preferring classical Socratic Aristotelian logic to modern symbolic logic, even if the latter may be more theoretically adequate. Excuse me. It is like the difference between Einsteinian physics and Newtonian physics, with its basic laws of motion and its principles of simple machines. Though Einstein is theoretically superior, Newton is still much more practical for beginners. I think I have never found anyone except a professional philosopher who actually used symbolic logic in actual conversation or debate. Number 4. This book it's linguistic. It emphasizes the use and understanding of ordinary language, e.g., it devotes considerable time to translating ordinary language into logical form, and it uses the logical form closest to ordinary language. Because this is a skill teachers usually assume, but students usually lack, probably because of the decline in the teaching of grammar. I find today's students much more confused by language and less by mathematical symbols than previous generations. They are the digital generation, not the verbal. They need to relearn the logic of language, for thought can no more escape words than fish can escape water. There is, of course, a need for new and specialized forms of mathematical logic too, but this need is being well supplied, while the more basic need for the more basic logic is not being well supplied. Number 5, it's readable. Its linguistic style is popular, personal, informal, light, and sometimes even humorous. Number 6, this book is traditional. Its master is Aristotle, the master of common sense, the man whose philosophy has become as embedded in the Western tradition as Confucius's became embedded in the Chinese. Aristotle's master was Plato. Quote, "All of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato," said Whitehead in The Last Battle. C.S. Lewis has the old professor say, quote, "It's all in Plato, all in Plato. Bless me, what do they teach them at these schools?" End quote. Lewis says of his own thought, "To lose what I owe to Plato and Aristotle would be like the amputation of a limb," end quote. From Rehabilitations, the idea of an English school. Plato's master was Socrates, the most interesting philosopher who ever lived, and the father of the application of logic to philosophical questions. When Aristotle wrote the world's first logic text, he was reflecting on what Socrates had already done, defining the principles of Socrates' practice, thus our title, Socratic Logic. This book is also traditional in the sense that it uses many classic examples from history and the great books. A side benefit is thus the student's exposure to these many nuggets of traditional wisdom, any one of which may someday enable him to win a large amount of money on a quiz show somewhere down in Plato's cave. Since tradition, i.e., all of human history up until the present, has been much more religious than the present, many of the examples are about religious questions. There are at least 5 advantages to this. Number 1, religious questions are intrinsically interesting. Only a fascinatingly dull mind is more fascinated with questions about life insurance rates than with questions about life after death. Number 2, they are not only subjectively interesting, but objectively, intrinsically important, whether they are to be answered affirmatively or negatively. Religion is either humanity's most important wisdom or its most important illusion. Number 3, they are by nature not culturally or temporally relative, like most questions of politics and ideology, but universally human. Number 4, they are close to philosophical questions and lead naturally into them. And number 5, and they are difficult, challenging, and mysterious. Believers or non-believers in any religion should be able to use this book with profit. It makes no religious or anti-religious assumptions. Number 7. Okay, so the 7th reason why this book is good is it's commonsensical. Logic is like psychoanalysis in that it does not impose anything upon you from outside, but only clarifies what is already present in you. Good logic never contradicts common sense. If we mean by quote-unquote common sense, not something the polls determine. That's only fashionable opinions, but something naturally and innately present in every mind. The American philosopher C.I. Lewis wrote that, quote, everyone knows the distinction of cogent reasoning from fallacy. The study of logic appeals to no criterion not already present in the learner's mind. End quote. Okay. If any principle in this book ever seems to contradict what you know by innate common sense, something is wrong with that principle. This is one of the main reasons for preferring traditional Aristotelian logic to the more fashionable modern symbolic logic. Aristotelian logic is far closer to common sense. That is why it is far easier to apply and use in ordinary conversations. We all have used logic already, unconsciously, many times every day. Even animals do that. Chrysippus, a Stoic philosopher of the 3rd century, watched a dog chasing a rabbit come to a fork in the road. The dog sniffed at 2 of the 3 paths and then ran down the 3rd without taking the time to sniff at it. Even the dog instinctively used logic to catch a real-world rabbit. He used a disjunctive syllogism. Either the rabbit took road A, or road B, or road C, not A or B, therefore C. In one of Molière's comedies, Monsieur Jourdain suddenly, I don't read French, excuse me. Jourdain suddenly discovers, to his amazement, that he has been speaking in prose all his life. You have been thinking and speaking in logic all your life. This course helps you to know thyself. So we have a footnote from the C.I. Lewis. And it says, interestingly, Christian apologist C.S. Lewis was once confused with C.I. Lewis, who went on to be an important developer of symbolic logic. When C.S. Lewis saw a review of the principles of symbolic logic, which attributed the work to him, he wrote to his father, I am writing back to tell them that they've got rather muddled. Symbolic logic, forsooth, from C.S. Lewis's letters, 25th of May, 1919. Okay, moving on. Number 8, 17 ways this book is different. Number 8, it's philosophical, both in its applications and in its foundations. Of all the applications of logic, philosophy is the most, subjectively interesting and the most objectively speaking important. Philosophy asks the big questions. Capital B, capital Q, big questions. This book exposes students to the ideas of the great philosophers all along the way by frequent quotations from them in its exercises, and ends with a series of chapters which use logic to introduce the fundamental questions of metaphysics, philosophical theology, cosmology, ethics, anthropology, and epistemology. It prepares students for reading great books, not Dick and Jane. Philosophy is not only an application of logic, but logic also has philosophical foundations. Logic is not always philosophically neutral. Different kinds of logic sometimes imply or presuppose importantly different philosophical positions. We'll see that in section 3, which is a couple pages away, page 15 of this book. This book's philosophy is Aristotelian realism. It dares to take a philosophical stand on controversial issues like truth and certainty and universals. It affirms all three, by the way. This stand is neither ideological nor religious, but commonsensical and traditional. But precisely because it is commonsensical and traditional, it is countercultural and controversial in today's philosophical marketplace. Number 9, it's constructive. It teaches how to make good arguments as well as how to refute bad ones. In such constructive lessons as how to use Socratic method, how to write a good essay, how to read a book, how to organize an outline, how to debate, and how to argue logically with difficult people. For some mysterious reason, these practical arts are usually neglected in logic books. Number 10, it's clearly divided. There are 89 sections, or mini chapters, in the 16 chapters of this book. But most of them are very short. Each section teaches only one basic point. This enhances clarity for the beginning student. Some logic textbooks try to teach too many things in a single section, and the result is confusion. This book does only one thing at a time. The sections are determined by content, not by length. Since there is only one basic point per section, and since some points are easier than others, some sections are much shorter than others. I mean, why not? Why should quantity determine quality? Why should the accidental determine the essential? Number 11, it's flexible. This book is flexible, and that makes it different than other logic books. The division into so many sections gives the teacher the option to select a mix and match of sections in many different ways, depending on the emphasis desired. There are 4 kinds of sections: basic logic, advanced logic, practical applications, and philosophical logic. The table of contents marks the basic sections B, marks the philosophical sections, the philosophical sections P, and puts the practical application sections in chapter 15. This allows the book to be used in at least 10 different ways, ranging from the very short to the very long. Those 10 different ways. Number 1, the bare basics only. Number 2, the basic sections plus the philosophical sections. Number 3, the basic sections plus the more advanced sections in logic. Number 4, the basic sections plus the practical application sections. Number 5, the basic sections plus only 2 of these 3 additions. Number 6, all of the book. Number 7, all or some of it supplemented by a text in symbolic logic. Number 8, all or some of it supplemented by a text in inductive logic. Number 9, all or some of it supplemented by a text in rhetoric or informal logic. Number 10, all or some of it supplemented by readings in and applications to the great philosophers. The first option should take about half a semester, 2 through 6 a whole semester, and 7 through 10 up to 2 semesters. In one semester, 14-week, 1 class a week course, you can combine any or all of the following chapters into single class lessons. Number 1, the introduction and chapter 1, 2, chapters 6 and 7, 3, chapters 8 and 9, 4, chapters 10 and 11, 5, chapters 15 and 16. Okay. Number 12. This book is short. The first few options above give you a short, basic, no frills, no fat logic text. Number 13. It's selective. It emphasizes a relatively small number of, quote, big ideas that the student will always need and use and remember, rather than the usual logic text's many quote unquote bells and whistles that students will rarely use. Number 14, it's innovative where it needs to be. It includes some specific things most other logic texts do not, such as a clear distinction between 6 quite different kinds of induction, a unique explanation of the square of opposition that is much cleaner and simpler than any other, a simple, streamlined solution to the problem of existential import, an overview of the difference between the two logics and its philosophical significance, practical advice on Socratic method, Socratic debates, and writing Socratic dialogues, many interfacings with philosophy, practical applications of logic to writing and debating, an expanded list of material fallacies, 49, divided into 7 categories. This is the most complete list of material fallacies that I know of, except for 2 books entirely devoted to fallacies, which are Fallacy, the Counterfeit of Argument by Fernside and Halther, published by Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, Prentice Hall in 1959, which lists 51, and the other book, the second of the 2, Historians' Fallacies, by David H. Fisher from New York, Harper and Row in 1979, which lists 112 fallacies. Historians' Fallacies by David H. Fisher. That's a lot of fallacies. Anyways, number 15. It is interactive. It includes many exercises because this is how a logic course takes in students' minds and lives. It is more effective to master a few important principles by much practice than to be exposed to so many principles and so little practice that you cannot remember and apply the principles after the course is over. We remember general principles only by particular experiences in applying them. This practical empiricism, right, is part of the Aristotelian heritage behind this book. A suggestion for teachers. Okay. Instead of lecturing on the text, which would probably be only rehashing it, let it teach itself, but leave plenty of time for student questions on it. A suggested class format. 1, first, discuss all student questions about the pages that were assigned, including exercises. 2, then a short quiz, weekly or even daily. 3, then go over the correct answers to the quiz so students can immediately learn from their mistakes. And 4, then introduce the next assignment. We won't be doing this here during this reading. I'm just going along with the text here. One more suggestion. If there are not enough questions and only a small number of students, require at least 2 written questions from each student at the very beginning of each class for you to answer, or have other students answer. In fact, this is something that we could do inside of the Discord server or town hall every other week. More about that at the end. All right, so number 16. This book, it's holistic. It emphasizes the whole, the big picture, the structure and outline of the whole of logic. It repeatedly situates each topic within the 3 acts of the mind overview of the course, so that the student has a sense of where everything fits and does not feel lost. Teachers tend to underestimate this need for a continual orientation check and how much confidence it gives the confused student. And number 17, it is classroom tested, based on the experience of teaching many kinds of logic in many kinds of ways to many kinds of students at many levels of intelligence and background at many kinds of schools over the years. Sweet. All right, so that's the 17 reasons why this book is different. Let's move on to section 3, called The Two Logics, labeled with a P. All right, this section can be omitted without losing anything you will need later on in the book. It's here both to satisfy the advanced student's curiosity and to sell the approach of this book to prospective teachers who may question its emphasis on Aristotelian rather than symbolic logic, by justifying this choice philosophically, of course. All right, so almost 400 years before Christ, Aristotle wrote the world's first logic textbook. Actually, it was 6 short books, which collectively came to be known as the organon, or instrument, quote-unquote instrument, from then until 1913. Okay, when Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead published Principia Mathematica, the first classic of mathematical or symbolic logic. All students learned Aristotelian logic, the logic taught in this book. The only other quote-unquote new logic for 24 centuries was an improvement on the principles of inductive logic by Francis Bacon's Novum Organum, okay, which translates into English as the new organon. Bacon wrote this in the 17th century, and another by John Stuart Mill in the 19th century. Inductive reasoning could be very roughly and inadequately defined as reasoning from concrete particular instances known by experience, while deduction reasons from general principles. Induction yields only probability, while deduction yields certainty. So Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are mortal. Therefore, probably all men are mortal. This is an example of inductive reasoning. All men are mortal, and Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This is an example of deductive reasoning. Okay, today nearly all logic textbooks use the new mathematical or symbolic logic as a kind of new language system for deductive logic. It is not a new logic. Logical principles are unchangeable, like the principles of algebra. It is more like changing from Roman numerals to Arabic numerals. There are at least 3 reasons for this change. And they are, number 1, the first and most important one is that the new logic really is superior to the old in efficiency for expressing many long and complex arguments, as Arabic numerals are to Roman numerals, or a digital computer to an analog computer, or writing in shorthand to writing in longhand. However, longhand is superior to shorthand in other ways. E.g., it has more beauty and elegance, it is intelligible to more people, and it gives a more personal touch. That is why most people prefer longhand most of the time, as most beginners prefer simpler computers or even pens. It is somewhat similar in logic. Most people, quote-unquote, argue in longhand, i.e. ordinary language. And Aristotelian logic stays close to ordinary language. That is why Aristotelian logic is more practical for beginners. Even though symbolic logic is superior in sophistication, it depends on common sense logic as its foundation and root. Thus, you will have a firmer foundation for all advanced logics if you first master the most basic logic. Strong roots are the key to healthy branches and leaves for any tree. Any farmer knows that the way to get better fruit is to tend to the roots, not the fruits. This is only an analogy. Analogies do not prove anything. This is a common fallacy. They only illuminate and illustrate. But it is an illuminating analogy, nonetheless. Modern symbolic logic is mathematical logic. Okay, a quote. Quote, modern symbolic logic has been developed primarily by mathematicians with mathematical applications in mind, end quote. This from one of its defenders, not one of its critics, named Henry C. Bayerly in a primer of logic, published in New York, Harper and Row, 1973, from page 4 of that book, A Primer of Logic. Mathematics is a wonderful invention for saving time and empowering science, but it is not very useful in most ordinary conversations, especially philosophical conversations. The more important the subject matter, the less relevant mathematics seems. Its forte is quantity, not quality. Mathematics is the only totally clear, utterly unambiguous language in the world. Yet, it cannot say anything very interesting about anything very important. Compare the exercises in a symbolic logic text with those in this text. How many are taken from the great books? How many are from conversations you could have had in real life? Okay, number 2. A second reason for the popularity of symbolic logic is probably its more scientific and exact form. The very artificiality of its language is a plus for its defenders, but it is a minus for ordinary people. In fact, Ludwig Wittgenstein, probably the most influential philosophical logician of the 20th century, admitted in Philosophical Investigations that, quote, because of the basic differences between natural and artificial languages, often such translations between natural language sentences and artificial symbolic language are not even possible in principle, end quote. And then another quote from Stephen N. Thomas: many logicians now agree that the methods of symbolic logic are of little practical usefulness in dealing with much reasoning encountered in real life situations, end quote. Stephen N. Thomas has that in Practical Reasonings in Natural Language, published by Prentice Hall in 1973. And in philosophy, quote from Andrew Bachhuber, quote, however helpful symbolic logic may be as a tool of the sciences, it is relatively useless as a tool of philosophy. Philosophy aims at insight into principles and into the relationship of conclusions to the principles from which they are derived. Symbolic logic, however, does not aim at giving such insight, end quote. Andrew Bachhuber has that in Introduction to Logic, published by Appleton Century Crofts in 1957, particularly on page 318 of Introduction to Logic. Number 3. But there is a third reason for the popularity of symbolic logic among philosophers, which is more substantial, for it involves a very important difference in philosophical belief. The old Aristotelian logic was often scorned by 20th century philosophers because it rests on two commonsensical but unfashionable philosophical presuppositions. The technical names for them are epistemological realism and metaphysical realism. These two positions are held by the vast majority of all philosophers for over 2,000 years, roughly from Socrates to the 18th century, and are still held by most ordinary people today, since they seem so commonsensical, but they were not held by many of the influential philosophers of the past 3 centuries. The following summary should not scare off beginners. It is much more abstract and theoretical than most of the rest of this book. The first of these two presuppositions, epistemological realism, is the belief that the object of human reason, when reason is working naturally and rightly, is objective reality as it really is. That human reason can know objective reality and can sometimes know it with certainty. That when we say 2 apples plus 2 apples must always be 4 apples, or that apples grow on a tree, we are saying something true about the universe. Not just about how we think or about how we choose to use symbols and words. Today, many philosophers are skeptical of this belief and call it naive, largely because of 2 18th century quote-unquote Enlightenment philosophers named Hume and Kant. That's David Hume and Immanuel Kant. Hume inherited from his predecessor, John Locke, the fatal assumption that the immediate object of human knowledge is our own ideas rather than objective reality. Locke naively assumed that we could know that these ideas correspond, quote unquote, correspond to objective reality, somewhat like photographs. But it is difficult to see how we can be sure any photograph accurately corresponds to the real object of which it is a photograph if the only things we can ever know directly are photographs and not real objects. Hume drew the logical conclusion of skepticism from Locke's premise. Once he limited the objects of knowledge to our own ideas, Hume then distinguished 2 kinds of propositions expressing these ideas. What he called matters of fact and relations of ideas. What Hume called relations of ideas are essentially what Kant later called analytic propositions, and what logicians now call tautologies. Propositions that are true by definition, true only because their predicate merely repeats all or part of their subject, e.g., trees are trees, or unicorns are not non-unicorns, or unmarried men are men. What Hume called matters of fact are essentially what Kant called synthetic propositions. Propositions whose predicate adds some new information to the subject, like no Englishman is 25 feet tall, or some trees never shed their leaves. And these matters of fact, according to Hume, could be known only by sense observation. Thus, they were always particular, e.g., those 2 men are bald, rather than universal, e.g., all men are mortal. For we do not sense universals like all men, only particular, like these 2 men. Common sense says that we can be certain of some universal truths, e.g., that all men are mortal, and therefore that Socrates is mortal because he is a man. But according to Hume, we cannot be certain of universal truths like all men are mortal, because the only way we can come to know them is by generalizing from particular sense experiences. This man is mortal, and that man is mortal, etc. And we cannot sense all men, only some, so our generalization can only be probable. Hume argued that particular facts deduced from these only probable general principles could never be known or predicted with certainty. If it is only probably true that all men are mortal, then it is only probably true that Socrates is mortal. The fact that we have seen the sun rise millions of times does not prove that it will necessarily rise tomorrow. Okay, so Hume's bottom line conclusion from this analysis is skepticism. There is no certain knowledge of objective reality, what he called matters of fact, only of our own ideas. he calls relations of ideas, right? We only have probable knowledge of objective reality. Even scientific knowledge, Hume thought, was only probable, not certain, because science assumes the principle of causality. And this principle, according to Hume, is only a subjective association of ideas in our minds. Because we have seen a constant conjunction of birds and eggs, because we have seen eggs follow birds so often, we naturally assume that the bird is the cause of the egg, but we do not see causality itself, the causal relation itself between the bird and the egg. And we certainly do not see, with our eyes, the universal, quote-unquote, principle of causality. So Hume concluded that we do not really have the knowledge of objective reality that we naturally think we have. We must be skeptics if we are only human beings. Excuse me, not human beings. Humean beings. Kant accepted most of Hume's analysis, but said, in effect, I can't accept your skeptical conclusion. He avoided this conclusion by claiming that human knowledge does not fail to do its job because its job is not to conform to objective reality, or things in themselves, as he called it, i.e., to correspond to it or copy it. Rather, knowledge constructs or forms reality as an artist constructs or forms a work of art. The knowing subjective determines the known object rather than vice versa. Human knowledge does its job very well, but its job is not to learn what it is, but to make what is, to form it and structure it and impose meanings on it. Kant distinguished three such levels of imposed meanings. The two forms of apperception, which are time and space, 12 abstract logical categories, such as causality, necessity, and relation, and the three, quote-unquote, ideas of pure reason, God, self, and world. Three ideas of pure reason. Thus, the world of experience is formed by our knowing it rather than our knowledge being formed by the world. Kant called this idea his Copernican revolution in philosophy. It is sometimes called epistemological idealism or Kantian idealism, to distinguish it from epistemological realism. Okay, so epistemology is that division of philosophy which studies human knowing. The term epistemological idealism is sometimes used. I'm sorry, there's a typo in the book. My bad. Is sometimes used in a different way to mean the belief that ideas rather than objective reality are the objects of our knowledge. In that sense, Locke and Hume are epistemological idealists too. But if we use epistemological idealism to mean that the belief that the human idea, or knowing, or consciousness, determines its object rather than being determined by it, then Kant is the first epistemological idealist. So the bottom line, the quote-unquote bottom line for logic is that if you agree with either Hume or Kant, logic becomes the mere manipulation of our symbols, not the principle for a true orderly knowledge of an ordered world. For instance, according to epistemological idealism, General categories like relation, or quality, or cause, or time are only mental classifications we make, not real features of the world that we discover. In such a logic, genus and species mean something very different than in Aristotelian logic. They mean only any larger class or smaller subclass that we mentally construct. But for Aristotle, a genus is the general or common part of a thing's real essential nature. E.g., animal is man's genus, and a species is the whole essence, e.g., rational animal is man's species. See chapter 3, sections 2 and 3. Another place where modern symbolic logic merely manipulates mental symbols while traditional Aristotelian logic expresses insight into objective reality is the interpretation of a conditional or hypothetical proposition such as, if it rains, I will get wet. Aristotelian logic, like common sense, interprets this proposition as an insight into real causality. The rain causes me to get wet. I am predicting the effect from the cause. But symbolic logic does not allow this commonsensical, realistic interpretation. It is skeptical of the naive assumption of epistemological realism, that we can know real things like real causality, and this produces the radically anti-commonsensical, or, as they say so euphemistically, counterintuitive problem of material implication. Then we'll see more about that in a few more pages on page 23. So besides epistemological realism, Aristotelian logic also implicitly assumes metaphysical realism. Metaphysics is that division of philosophy which investigates what reality is. Epistemology is that division of philosophy which investigates what knowing is. Epistemological realism contends that the object of intelligence is reality. Metaphysical realism contends that reality is intelligible, that it includes a real order, that when we say man is a rational animal, e.g., we are not imposing an order on a reality that is really random or chaotic or unknowable, that we are expressing our discovery of order, not our creation of order. That categories like man or animal or thing or attribute are taken from reality into our language and thought, not imposed on reality from our language and thought. Metaphysical realism naturally goes with epistemological realism. Technically, metaphysical realism is the belief that universal concepts correspond to reality, that things really have common natures, that universals such as human nature are real, and that we can know them. There are two forms of metaphysical realism. Plato thought that these universals were real things in themselves, while Aristotle thought, more commonsensically, that they were real aspects of things, which we mentally abstracted from things. We'll learn more about that in chapter 2, section 3, which is called The Problem of Universals. The opposite of realism is nominalism. Okay? The belief that universals are only man-made, nomine, which translates into names. William of Ockham, he lived from 1285 through 1349. He is the philosopher who is usually credited or debited with being the founder of nominalism. Aristotelian logic assumes both epistemological realism and metaphysical realism because it begins with what we call the first act of the mind, the act of understanding a universal or a nature or an essence, such as the nature of apple or man. These universals or essences are known by concepts and expressed by what logic calls terms. Then two of these universal terms are related as subjects and predicates of propositions, e.g., apples are fruits, or man is mortal. Okay, so J. Lenoble is French. I stink at French. But he has a quote in La Notion de l'expérience, which is published in Paris in 1930. This is from page 35 of that book. He says, quote, Aristotle never intended his logic to be a merely formal calculus, like mathematics. He tied logic to his ontology, metaphysics. Thinking in concepts presupposes that the world is formed of stable species, end quote. Symbolic logic is a set of symbols and rules for manipulating them. Okay? The rules for manipulating the symbols without needing to know their meaning or content or their relationship to the real world. Their quote-unquote truth in the traditional commonsensical sense of quote-unquote truth. A computer can do symbolic logic. It is quantitative, meaning digital, not qualitative. It is reducible to mathematics. The new logic is sometimes called propositional logic, as well as mathematical logic or symbolic logic, because it begins with propositions, not terms. For terms, like man or apple, express universals or essences or natures, and this implicitly assumes metaphysical realism, that universals are real, and epistemological realism, that we can know them as they really are. Typically, modern philosophers criticize this assumption as naive, but it seems to me that this is a very reasonable assumption, and not naive at all. It is too naive to assume, is it too naive to assume that we know what an apple is? The new logic has no means of saying, or even prevents us from saying, what anything is. And if we cease to say it, we will soon cease to think it, for there will be no holding places in our language for the thought. Language is the house of thought, and homelessness is as life-threatening for thoughts as it is for people. If we should begin to speak and think only in nominalist terms, this would be a monumental historic change. It would reverse the evolutionary events by which man rose above the animal in gaining the ability to know abstract universals. It would be the mental equivalent of going naked on all fours, living in trees, and eating bugs and bananas. Could monkeys have evolved by natural selection from nominalists? While it may be extremist to suggest it, such a mental devolution is not intrinsically impossible. And changes in logic are not wholly unrelated to it. Already, internet logic, or the logic of spontaneous association by keywords, is replacing genus and species logic, or the logic of an ordered hierarchy of objectively real categories. To most modern minds, those last 7 words sound almost as archaic as alchemy or feudalism. Many criticize them as ideologically dangerous. These critics dislike categories because they, quote unquote, feel that phrase is a category confusion, by the way. They feel that classifications and universal statements about classes, such as Hittites could not read Hebrew, constitute prejudice or judgmentalism, oppression, or even hate speech. Logic and social change are not unrelated. Not only our logicians, but also our society no longer thinks primarily about the fundamental metaphysical question, the question of what things are, the question of the nature of things. Instead, we think about how we feel about things, about how we can use them, how we see them behave, how they work, how we can change them, or how we can predict and control their behavior by technology. But all this does, I'm sorry, I need to take a drink of water real quick. But all this does not raise us above the animal level in kind, only in degree. The higher animals, too, have feelings and things to use, and sight and action, and even a kind of technology of behavior prediction and control. For the art of hunting is an art of predicting and controlling the behavior of other animals. What do we have that no mere animal has? The thing that many modern philosophers vilify. We have abstraction. We have the power to abstract and understand universals. This is the thing traditional logic is founded on, and this is the thing symbolic logic ignores or denies. Sabotage. Logic is deeply related to moral and ethical changes in both thought and practice. All previous societies had a strong, nearly universal, and rarely questioned consensus about at least some basic aspects of a natural moral law, about what was natural and what was unnatural. There may not have been a greater obedience to this law, but there was a much greater knowledge of it or agreement about it. Today, especially in the realm of sex, by far the most radically changed area of human life in both belief and practice, our more advanced minds find the old language about unnatural acts not only politically incorrect, but literally incomprehensible, because they no longer accept the legitimacy of the very question of the nature of a thing. Issues like homosexuality, contraception, masturbation, pedophilia, incest, divorce, adultery, abortion, and even bestiality are increasingly debated in other terms than the nature of sexuality or the nature of femininity and masculinity. It is not an unthinkable suspicion that one of the most powerful forces driving the new logic is more social than philosophical, and more sexual than logical. Symbolic logic naturally fosters utilitarian ethics, which is essentially an ethic of consequences. The fundamental principle of utilitarianism is that an act is good if its probable consequences result in what they quote, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, end quote, of people. It is an, quote, if then, not then, if then ethics of calculating consequences. Essentially, the quote unquote, the ends justify the means. Though that formula is somewhat ambiguous. Symbolic logic fits this perfectly because it is essentially an if-then logic, a calculation of logical consequences. Its basic unit is the proposition P or Q, and its basic judgment is if P, then Q. In contrast, Aristotelian logic naturally fosters a natural law ethic, an ethic of universal principles based on the nature of things, especially the nature of man. For its basic unit is the term, a subject, S, or a predicate, P, within a proposition. So predicate could be uppercase P, and within the proposition, lowercase p. And its basic judgment is, quote, all S is P, end quote. A statement of universal truth about the nature of S and P. Just a brief aside, I'd like to point out something about utilitarian ethics. It's kind of been on my mind for a while. I've always seen utilitarian ethics as something that is maybe leading one toward postmodern thought or moral relativism, in the sense of, like, I mean, it says it right here in the book. The greatest happiness for the greatest number. So the fundamental principle of utilitarianism is that an act is good. All right, an act is good if its probable consequences result in, quote, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So, I mean, we're talking about a philosophy of utilitarianism that could lead one to go, well, if I murder 7 million people or like 10 million people, then everybody left over, I mean, there's going to be more food for them. So, I mean, they can go and do something that's just morally, objectively, like morally wrong, and justify it by the ends. So the end justifies the means. That's moral relativism right there. That's saying we can do what we want if the outcome is good. So, I do not endorse utilitarianism, and I would be very cautious against people that think that way. It's better than not thinking at all, I suppose, or being an order follower, I suppose. But I mean, it's still moral relativism, so exercise caution. And with that, I guess we could continue. Actually, there's a Tool song from their first EP, Opiate. It's called Jerk Off. If you want to learn more about utilitarianism or moral relativism, you can go listen to that song. If consequences dictate my course of action, then it doesn't matter what's right. It's only wrong if I get caught. That's one of the lyrics from that song, and it is quite striking, the rest of that song, the way that it goes. So anyways, yeah, go look that up if you like, metal. And so we can continue with the reading here. So the very nature of reason itself is understood differently by the new symbolic logic than it was by the traditional Aristotelian logic. Reason used to mean essentially that all that distinguishes man from the beasts, all right, including intuition, understanding, wisdom, moral conscience, and aesthetic appreciation, as well as calculation. Reason now usually means only the last of those powers. So it used to mean all those things. Now it just means aesthetic appreciation and calculation. That is why many thinkers today, who seem at first quite sane in other ways, actually believe that there is no fundamental difference between natural intelligence and artificial intelligence. In other words, you are nothing but a computer plus an ape. Having met some of these people at MIT, I must admit that their self-description sometimes seems quite accurate. Aristotelian logic is not exact enough for the nominalistic mathematical logician. It is too exact for the pop psychology subjectivist or new age mystic. Out at sea there between Scylla And Charybdis, it reveals by contrast the double tragedy of modern thought in its alienation between form and matter, structure and content, validity and meaning. This alienated mind was described memorably by C.S. Lewis. He said, "The two hemispheres of my brain stood in sharpest contrast. On the one hand, a glib and shallow rationalism. On the other, a many-islanded sea of myth and poetry. Nearly all that I loved, I believed subjective. Nearly all that was real, I thought grim and meaningless." End quote. That was from Surprised by Joy. Neither mathematical logic nor quote-unquote experience can heal this gap, but Aristotelian logic can. It is thoughts, soul, and body together, yet not confused. Mathematical logic alone is abstract and anglistic, and sense experience and feeling alone is concrete and animalistic. But Aristotelian logic is a human instrument for human beings. Aristotelian logic is also easier, simpler, and therefore time-saving. For example, in a logic textbook misleadingly entitled Practical Reasoning in Natural Language, the author takes 6 full pages of symbolic logic to analyze a simple syllogism from Plato's Republic that proves that justice is not rightly defined as, quote, telling the truth and paying back what is owed, end quote, because returning a weapon to a madman is not justice, but it is telling the truth and paying back what is owed. Pages 224 through 230. Another single syllogism of Hume's takes 8 pages to analyze, on pages 278 through 286 from that book called Practical Reasoning in Natural Language. I have found that students who are well trained in Aristotelian logic are much better at arguing and at understanding arguments than students who are trained only in symbolic logic. For Aristotelian logic is the logic of the 4 most basic verbal communication arts: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. It is the logic of Socrates. I almost said Socrates. I was joking around about Bill and Ted earlier. It is the logic of Socrates. If you want to be a Socrates, this is the logic you should begin with. The old logic is like the old classic movies, strong on substance rather than sophistication. The new logic is like typically modern movies, strong on special effects, but weak on substance, meaning theme, character, and plot. Strong on the technological bells and whistles, but weak on the human side. But logic should be a human instrument. Logic was made for man, not man for logic. Okay, so we're going to go on with the problem of what we're calling material implication. The following issue is quite abstract and difficult, though I shall try to make it as simple as possible. It is included because I believe it shows that something is rotten in the state of Denmark, so to speak, at the very heart of the new logic. For a fuller treatment of the new logic, see the appendix on page 364 for all you hard copy owners out there of this book. Logic is most especially about reasoning, or inference, the process of thinking by which we draw conclusions from evidence, moving from one proposition to another. The proposition we begin with is called a premise, and the proposition we move to, or infer, or reason to, is called a conclusion. The simplest and most straightforward kind of reasoning is to move from a true premise, or more usually from a number of true premises together, to a true conclusion. But we can also use false propositions in good reasoning, since a false conclusion cannot be logically proved from true premises. We can know that if the conclusion is false, then one of the premises must also be false in a logically valid argument. A logically valid argument is one in which the conclusion necessarily follows from its premises. In a logically valid argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. And in an invalid argument, this is not so. All men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is a valid argument. Dogs have 4 legs, and Lassie has 4 legs, therefore Lassie is a dog. This is not a valid argument. The conclusion, Lassie is a dog, may be true, but it has not been proved by this argument. It does not follow from the premises. Bleh. Now, in Aristotelian logic, a true conclusion logically follows from, or is proved by, or is implied by, or is validly inferred from only some premises and not others. The above argument about Lassie is not a valid argument according to Aristotelian logic. Its premises do not prove its conclusion. In common sense, our innate logical sense agrees. However, modern symbolic logic disagrees. One of its principles is that, quote, if a statement is true, then that statement is implied by any statement whatever, end quote. Since it is true that Lassie is a dog, quote, dogs have 4 legs, implies that Lassie is a dog. In fact, dogs do not have 4 legs, also implies that Lassie is a dog. Even false statements, even statements that are self-contradictory, like grass is not grass, validly imply any true conclusion in symbolic logic. And a second strange principle is that, quote, if a statement is false, then it implies any statement whatever, end quote. Such as, going on, dogs do not have 4 legs, implies that Lassie is a dog, and also that Lassie is not a dog, and that 2 plus 2 are 4, and that 2 plus 2 are not 4. This principle is often called the paradox of material implication. Ironically, material implication means exactly the opposite of what it seems to mean. It means that the matter or content of a statement is totally irrelevant to its logically implying or being implied by other statements. Common sense says that Lassie being a dog or not being a dog has nothing to do with 2 plus 2 being 4 or not being 4, but that Lassie being a collie and collies being dogs does have something to do with Lassie being a dog. But now, in the new logic, which departs from common sense here by totally sundering the rules for logical implication from the matter or content of the propositions involved. Thus, the paradox ought to be called the paradox of non-material implication. The paradox can be seen in the following imaginary conversation. So this imaginary conversation takes place between a logician and the logician's student. Logician. So, class, you see, if you begin with a false premise, anything follows. Student. I just can't understand that. Logician. Are you sure you don't understand that? Student. If I understand that, I'm a monkey's uncle. Logician. My point exactly. Goes on to laugh. Student. What's so funny? Logician. You just can't understand that. See, the relationship between a premise and a conclusion is called an implication. And the process of reasoning from the premise to the conclusion is called inference. In symbolic logic, the relation of implication is called a truth-functional connective, which means that the only factor that makes the inference valid or invalid, the only thing that makes it true or false to say that the premise or premises validly imply the conclusion, is not at all dependent on the content or matter of any of these propositions, but only whether the premise or premises are true or false, and whether the conclusion is true or false. The last paragraph was cruelly abstract. Let's try to be a little more specific. Okay, in symbolic logic, 1, if the premise or premises, let's just say the premise for short, are true and the conclusion is true, then the if-then proposition summarizing the implication is true. So if P is true and Q is true, then, quote, if P then Q, end quote, is true. So if grass is green, then Mars is red is true. Saying if grass is green, then Mars is red is true. So number 2, if the premise is true and the conclusion is false, then the, quote, if then proposition summarizing the implication is false. So if P is true and Q is false, then we have a, quote, if P then Q, end quote, is false. So this leads to, if grass is green, then Mars is not red, being false. Number 3, if the premise is false and the conclusion is true, then the if-then proposition summarizing the implication is true. If P is false and Q is true, then, quote, if P then Q, end quote, is true. So we have, if grass is purple, then Mars is red, end quote, being true. Now, number 4, if the premise is false and the conclusion is false, then the if-then proposition summarizing the implication is true. If P is false and Q is false, then if P then Q is true, okay? So if grass is purple, then Mars is purple is also true. All right. So in this logic, if the premise and the conclusion are both false, the premise implies the conclusion. Okay, so this would have been number 4. And if the premise is false and the conclusion is true, then the premise also implies the conclusion. This is number 3. Okay, so example number 3. So if the moon is blue, then the moon is red, like we saw in number 4. And if the moon is blue, then the moon is not blue. That was number 3. Okay. This may take some defensible sense mathematically. All right. But it certainly does not make sense commonsensically, for it does not seem to make sense in the real world. Logicians have an answer to the above charge. The answer is perfectly tight and logically consistent. This is part of the problem. Consistency is not enough. Logic should be not just a mathematically consistent system, but a human instrument for understanding reality, for dealing with real people and things and real arguments about the real world. This is the basic assumption of the old logic. If that assumption is naive and uncritical, unfashionable and unintelligent, well, welcome to Logic for Dummies. All right. Section 4. All of logic in 2 pages, an overview. This is one of the shortest and simplest sections in the book. And we're going to finish out tonight with this section, okay, for the stream. This is one of the shortest and simplest sections in this book, but it is also one of the most important, for it is the foundation for everything else in logic. If you do not understand it clearly, you will be hopelessly confused later on. It is explained in more detail in the next section, section 5. The ancient philosophers defined man as the quote-unquote rational animal. To be human is, among other things, to reason, to give reasons for believing things to be true. We can see common forms or structures in all human reasoning, no matter what the contents or objects that we reason about. Logic studies those structures. The fundamental structure of all reasoning is the movement of the mind from premises to a conclusion. The conclusion is what you are trying to prove to be true. The premises are the reasons or evidence for the truth of the conclusion. The 2 basic kinds of reasoning are inductive and deductive. Inductive reasoning reasons from particular premises, e.g., I'm mortal, and you're mortal, and he's mortal, and she's mortal, usually to a more general or universal conclusion, e.g., all men are mortal. Deductive reasoning reasons from at least one general or universal premise, that all men are mortal is the example, usually to a more particular conclusion, example, I am mortal. Inductive reasoning yields only probability, not certainty. It is not certain that all men are mortal merely on the basis that 4 men or 4 million men are. Deductive reasoning, when correct, yields certainty. It is certain that if all men are mortal, and if I am a man, then I am mortal. A deductive argument succeeds in proving its conclusion to be true if and only if 3 conditions are met. These are the 3 checkpoints of any deductive argument. Number 1, first, all the terms must be clear and unambiguous. If a term is ambiguous, it should be defined to make it clear. Otherwise, the 2 parties to the argument may think they are talking about the same thing when they are not. Second, all premises must be true. You can, seem to, prove anything from false premises. For example, all Martians are infallible, and I am a Martian, therefore I am infallible. And third, the argument must be logically valid. That is, the conclusion must necessarily follow from the premises, so that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So, number 1, a term in logic is the subject or the predicate of a proposition, a declarative sentence. Terms are either clear or unclear. Terms cannot be either true or false. An example, mortal, is neither true nor false. The proposition, all men are mortal, is true, and the proposition, some men are not mortal, is false. Propositions are declarative sentences. They are either true or false. True is common sense usage. In common sense usage means corresponding to reality, and false means the opposite. There is no one simple or infallible way of telling whether any proposition is true or false. There is, however, a fairly simple and truly infallible way of telling whether an argument is valid or invalid. the laws of logic, which you will learn in this book. A deductive argument is logically valid if its conclusion necessarily follows from its premises, and valid if it does not. There are various forms of argument, and each form has its own inherent rules for validity. All the rules for each form of argument are natural to that form of argument and to the human mind. If at any point in this book you think that any of its logical laws contradict what you already implicitly know by innate common sense, please stop and check, for you must be misunderstanding either the laws of logic or what you think common sense tells you. For logic does nothing more than make explicit the rules everyone knows innately by common sense. Arguments are made up of propositions, premises and a conclusion, and propositions are made up of terms, subject and predicate. Terms are either clear or unclear. Propositions, whether premises or the conclusion, are either true or false. Arguments are either logically valid or invalid. Only terms can be clear or unclear. Only propositions can be true or false. Only arguments can be logically valid or invalid. So, the three questions you should habitually ask of yourself when writing or speaking, and of others when you are reading or listening to them are, number 1, are the terms all clear and unambiguous? Number 2, are the premises all true? And number 3, is the reasoning all logically valid? If the answer to all three of these questions is yes, then the conclusion of the argument must be true. So in order to disagree with any conclusion, you must show that there is either 1, an ambiguous term, or 2, a false premise, or 3, a logical fallacy in the argument such that the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premises. You will soon learn the rules for judging that. If you cannot do any of these three things, then honesty demands that you admit the conclusion has been proved to be true. All this applies to deductive arguments only. Inductive arguments do not claim certainty. Okay, let's just, all right. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead there just real quick. Hold on a second. I want to see, all right, so I think I want to call it there for tonight because I'd like to give this next section some real attention. So thank you for tuning in, and I really appreciate that. Check out the show notes for all the different ways that you can support the show here. I'm still trying to get the website back online, which would be cool eventually. But what's even cooler is that there's a membership section now where you can go to the Buy Me a Coffee link and sign up to be a member and join the Discord server. You get an invite to the Discord server, and you'll be able to come into a bi-weekly town hall where we can all hang out and create a community around the material, the content on this channel. And yeah, among other things in the future that will be exclusive to the members over there. And so that's pretty cool. And then, of course, you can go over to the One Great Work Network, the link there, and find all the different ways you could donate to the channel, and and that would be cool too. And check out AUTONOMY, Richard Grove's 12-week course of action, really sales and marketing, and working on projects and all sorts of other crazy cool things that are going on over there in AUTONOMY. The intro music was provided by Brendan Daniel. There's a link in there that you could click on and get over to his Instagram. He's an incredible friend and an incredible musician. And I really, really would love it if more people listen to his music. I mean, it's some of the best red pill jams out there. It really is. So check him out. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I'm not. Oh, just a friendly reminder, if there's anybody interested in part 1, there's also a link in the show notes for that. We're going to continue with the Socratic Logic series for quite a while. This is pretty important stuff that I'd like to put out there into the world, help people learn how to think and how to identify the trickery and the sophistry that's really kind of keeping everybody down out there in the world. Thank you to the people or the person that's been in the chat tonight. Mandatory myocarditis. You're awesome, dude. I haven't streamed in like a few months, and you're a real one, dude. I really appreciate you being here. And yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I'm missing. No, I don't think there is. So with that being said, I guess we'll just we'll call it a night. And just remember on your way out that you own yourself, okay? No one else owns you. You're not a slave. If you think that you're a slave, then you've been tricked. You've been tricked really badly. We can learn our way out of this. We can learn our way to freedom. Thank you for being here at Voluntarist Academy. I'm James Cordiner, and I'll see you guys next week. Same time, same place. Peace.